In the beginning, Bartholomew Cubbins didn't have 500 hats. He only had one hat, and it was probably the oldest and the plainest hat in the whole kingdom of Did where Cubbins lived. But Bartholomew liked it, especially because of the feather that always stuck straight up in the air. Hats are pretty cool. They can be formal, functional, stylish, but there are some people who just can't pull them off. Like poor Bartholomew Cubbins, who can't pull off a hat to save his life. Well, he can pull it off, but not without another identical hat magically appearing in its place. See how this actually does end up saving his life, and much more in the 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins by Dr. Seuss. Just after sunrise one Saturday morning, Bartholomew started for town. A pleasant breeze whistled through the feather in his hat. In his right hand he carried a basket of cranberries to sell at the market. He walked faster and faster until he got to the gates of the town. The sound of silver trumpets rang through the air. Hoofbeats clattered on cobbled streets. Clear the way! Clear the way! All the people rushed for the pavements. Bartholomew clutched his basket tighter. Hats off to the king! Shouted the captain of the king's own guard. On came the king's carriage. It swept past Bartholomew, and then suddenly its mighty brakes shrieked. Back up, the king commanded. The king leaned from his carriage window and fixed his eyes directly on Bartholomew Cubbins. Well, do you or do you not take off your hat before your king? Yes, indeed, sire. Then take it off this instant. But, sire, my hat is off. If that's your hat in your hand, then what's that on your head? It's a hat, sire, but it can't be mine. Someone behind me must have put it on my head. Bartholomew quickly snatched off the hat. It was exactly the same as his own hat. By the crown of my fathers, did I or did I not command you to take off your hat? You did, sire. I took it off. I took it off twice. Nonsense. There is still a hat upon your head. Another hat. Come. What is the meaning of all of this? I don't know, sire. It never happened to me before. Arrest this impudent trickster. We'll teach him to take off his hat. The captain of the king's own guard leaned down from his big brass saddle and grabbed Bartholomew Cubbins by his shirt. Away flew Bartholomew's basket. The cranberries bounced over the cobblestone and into the gutter. The captain and Bartholomew sped up the winding street towards the palace. Flup! The sharp wind whisked off Bartholomew's hat. Flup! Flop! 2 more flew off. Flup! Flew another and another. 4, 5, 6, 7. Bartholomew kept counting as the hats came faster and faster. His Majesty awaits in the throne room. Bartholomew walked on till he stood in the middle of the grand throne room. The king, in a long scarlet robe, was sitting on his throne. Beside him stood Sir Alaric, keeper of the king's records. Young man, I will give you one more chance. Will you take off your hat before your king? I will, sire, but I'm afraid it won't do any good. He took off his hat, and it didn't do any good. Another hat appeared on Bartholomew's head. He took off hat after hat until he was standing in a great pile of hats, and still a hat stood on Bartholomew's head. A little voice came up through the balcony window. What's the matter, Uncle Derwin? There's a boy in here, just about your age. He won't take off his hat. Well, you send him down here. I'll fix him. The king thought for a minute. Well, maybe you can. Send him down to the Grand Duke Wilfred. That won't come off. You stand over there. I need a little practice with my bow and arrow. He let fly an arrow. It grazed Bartholomew's head and nipped off his hat. Yet there on Bartholomew's head sat another hat. The arrows flew and flew till the Grand Duke's whole bag full of arrows was completely gone, and still a hat stood on Bartholomew's head. It's not fair! He threw down his bow and stamped upon it. 154 hats, gulped Sir Alaric. These hats are driving me insane. Fetch the yeoman of the Bowman. A gigantic man strode across the terrace. His bow was as big as the branch of a tree. Like a mad hornet, the arrow tore through the air towards Bartholomew Cubbins. The sharp arrow bit through his hat and carried it on and on for over half a mile. It plunked to a stop in the heart of an oak tree. Yet there on Bartholomew's head sat another hat. The face of the yeoman of the Bowman went as white as the palace walls. It's black magic! Oh dear, what can I do? What can I do? If I were king, I would chop off his head. Oh, dreadful thought, but I'm afraid we'll have to. Young man, march down those steps to the dungeon and tell the executioner to chop off your head. I must take off my hat. This is my last chance. One hat after another he tore from his head. 156, 157, down, down, down. 231, 232. Who's there? The king says you must chop off my head. I'd hate to. You seem like a pretty nice boy. Well, the king says you have to. All right, but first you gotta take off that hat of yours. Well, why? I don't know. It's just one of the rules. I can't execute you with your hat still on. The executioner leaned across the chopping block and flipped off Bartholomew's hat. What's this? Another hat sat on Bartholomew's head. He flipped this one off, and then another and another. Oh, fiddlesticks! I can't execute you at all. He shook hands with Bartholomew and sent him back upstairs to the king. What are you doing back here? I'm sorry, Your Majesty. My head can't come off with my hat still on. It's against the rules. So it can't. Now, how many hats does that make it? 346 hats. Uncle Derwin, send him up to the highest turret. And I, in person, will push him off. Wilfred! I'm surprised at you. But I guess it's a good idea. So the king and the Grand Duke Wilfred led Bartholomew Cubbins up to the highest turret. Up and up the turret stairs he climbed behind them. This is my very last chance. 347, 398, 399. Suddenly, Sir Alaric stopped. He looked. He took off his triangular spectacles, wiped them on his sleeve, and then looked again. The hats began to change. Hat 451 had not one, but two feathers. Hat 452 had three, and 453 also had three and a little red jewel. Each new hat was fancier than the hat just before. Your Majesty, but the king and the Grand Duke were far up where they couldn't hear. Step right there on that wall. I can't wait to push you off. But when Bartholomew stepped upon the wall, they gasped in amazement. There on Bartholomew's head sat the most beautiful hat that had ever been seen in the kingdom of Did. It had a ruby larger than even the king himself had ever owned. It had ostrich plumes and cockatoo plumes and mockingbird plumes and paradise plumes. Besides such a hat, even the king's crown seemed like nothing. The Grand Duke took a quick step forward. Wait! The king could not take his eyes off the magnificent hat. At 450, 499, and that makes exactly 500. My, boy, will you sell that for 500 pieces of gold? 500? Anything you say, sire. The king's hands trembled as he reached for the hat. Slowly Bartholomew felt the weight from the great hat lifting from his shoulders. He held his breath. Then suddenly, he felt the cool evening breeze blow through his hair. The head of Bartholomew Cubbins was bare. Look, Your Majesty, look! No, you look at me! He put the hat over his own crown. Then he sent Bartholomew home to his parents. No basket in his arm, no hat on his head, but with 500 pieces of gold in a bag. Neither Bartholomew Cubbins, nor King Derwin himself, nor anyone else in the kingdom of Did could ever explain how such a strange thing had happened. They could just say it just happened to happen, and wasn't very likely to ever happen again.